Paul has been a .NET developer for over 5 years, a speaker at Code Camp, as well as a volunteer for Code for Romania. Paul is constantly exploring new ideas and technical trends, and he does everything believing in teamwork and with a great sense of humor, as you will see. Ladies and gentlemen, Paul Antal.
Okay, hi everybody. Let's begin. So I'm gonna start with a bit of trivia about me. My name is Paul, like Andrea said. I've been a software developer for about 5 years now, and a bit ashamed to admit this, but I used to be a CSS abuser. Think you know what I'm talking about. You create a simple looking page for your customer. It's got a nice pretty layout, pink everywhere, images, buttons, it all looks nice. The HTML looks pretty, the CSS looks clean as well. You show it to the customer is happy with what he sees because he finally has something to look at. But good times never last. The customer goes home and starts thinking a bit. Maybe that image should be a bit taller. That button maybe should be aligned to the left. Maybe the page should change totally when I click on a button. Then he comes in the next day, shows you everything he's thought about. You hear him out, you understand what he wants. You might understand why he wants it as well. So you start making changes, add margins, add paddings, media queries, maybe floats if you feel daring, but it doesn't work. And you start getting desperate a bit. So you get a bit abusive with your CSS. You add important everywhere and get a bit spooked by the fact that every day what you do is add important to everything. You add margins, paddings without any reason in the world at all. Then at the end of the day, you go back home and you think about how good the times used to be. What went wrong? Well, what went wrong for me is that I lost control of my CSS basically. That's because I didn't totally understand it. So at some point I decided to make a change and work a bit on that. So I started reading specifications, articles online. I started experimenting with fancy things like sticky things. Don't ask about that. At some point, I started dreaming CSS, mostly nightmares. Don't ask about those either. But eventually it worked. I understood CSS-ish. And by ish, I mean, didn't have a full grasp of it. It still behaved in unexpected ways from time to time. But after looking a bit into it, it started to make sense. Now, that brings us to this point. Right now, I want to share to the world how to understand CSS step by step. I want to help people just the same way my hero helped me. Random YouTube Indian guy who knows everything. Right, so let's start. Basics. First thing, what's CSS? CSS is the thing that tells the user agent, which is generally the browser, but not always. That's what the specs call the thing that renders HTML and CSS. It tells the user agent how to draw HTML elements. The way it does that is the user agents calculate all the CSS properties, which need calculating because there's things like cascading and inheritance, which we won't really go through today, but irrelevant for the purpose of this presentation. It calculates all the CSS properties of each HTML element, and then using the display property specifically, decides how many boxes to draw for each element, because in the end, the website is just a tree of boxes. That's what we're going to talk about today. Now, looking for easy ways to explain this, I stumbled upon the CSS specs, the CSS3 module specs for the display property, and they had a very nice syntax for it that makes it really easy to understand what the display property does. Weird to find specs that actually make sense and they're easy to read, but they are there. Right, in the specs, there's 5 different properties defined for a display attribute. That's display outside, inside, list item, internal, and box. And we're gonna go through all of them in a quick demo because it's not really that easy to explain this stuff when you don't see the code itself. So for that purpose, I made this quick website here, wasn't really quick, but hey, where I have every single one of those explained on the side. You might see display internals missing here. I'll explain soon. And we're gonna start with display outside, sorry. Now, display outside defines how an element behaves in its parent's layout. Now, this is kind of a trick definition, I suppose, because mostly it's just gonna work for a specific layout, and that's the flow layout. We're gonna go through that when we move on to the next keyword. Right, so display inline is going to make your box behave like a word in the sentence, or rather like a phrase, a piece of text itself. That means that it's going to be placeable inside another piece of text. It's going to wrap to the next row if it doesn't fit. And generally it's going to align to the text properly. Now, there is a bit of a quirk to it, and that is you can't set a width and a height to it. It doesn't like that. So if I say I wanted this to be 300 pixels, doesn't do anything at all. Or if I say I wanted to say it's 1,000 pixels tall, again, doesn't do anything at all. That's because it's always going to take the size of its contents. In this case, it's going to take the size of the text inline element. Now, sometimes your content might be taller than the text it's going to be inline with. So I'm gonna simulate that by setting the font size here to 40 pixels, say. In which case you can see that each row here, if I move this like that, is going to have the same height as the biggest inline element in there. Now, because you have that, you sometimes might want to align items a bit differently than the default. And that's when you can use the vertically align property, which I tried to use on block elements in the starts of my CSS career, and it never worked. I didn't know why. This is why. And this allows you to align this with text. The default is baseline, which just means it's going to align the bottom of the text with the surrounding text. But you can also say bottom, which it's not clear if I show it like this, but if we use the fancy developer tools Chrome provides, the blue box in there, I'm pointing at my screen now, I know you can't see it, but I can't take the mouse away from there. The blue box there is the content box, and the vertical align bottom is going to align the bottom of the box with the outside text. Then you have top, which is going to do the same. Content box, it's at the top of the text, same as the top of this text. You also have these two, which I didn't know what they did for a while, but I found out. You know how you can have in math formulas small indices at the bottom? I think it's called subtext. I'm not sure. This aligns the element with the subtext. So if let's do that as well. If I edit this a bit and add a sub, sub, and because I'm gonna need it soon as well, I'm gonna add a sub, I think it's called, sub blah, there. Okay, this blah right here is going to be at the exact same line as the inline element there. Damn it, I can't find a way to easily show it to you unless I just move it like this. There we go, cool. Vertical line, blah. So the text here aligns with the blah. And if I move the super and I say this is now super instead, the bottom aligns with the super. So you can make your own exponentials and indices however you want them to be. You can make them be images or whatever inline element you want them to be. Right, another quirk of it is margins and paddings only work horizontally. If you look at this inline element, let me refresh the page. So we go back to defaults. It has a margin of 2 pixels. Let's make that higher, 200 pixels. Now, it has 200 pixels on the sides, but it didn't do anything on top and bottom. That's because it tries not to disrupt the flow of the text itself. And the same applies with the paddings. If I make this small enough for the inline element to go on the next row, you see the padding overlaps the text. Again, for the same reasons, it's trying not to upset the flow of the text. Right, other than these quirks, it's just a block that acts as text. Oh, another quirk is this one. This is technically 2 boxes in the box tree, but Chrome is not going to show you all the boxes. Just know that's how it's defined in the specs. That's it for the inline element. Its brother is display block. Display block is a lot simpler and clearer than inline. It's just a block. What it does is it's trying to fill in the entire width of the space you give it by default. It's not gonna allow anything to be on its left or on its right. And that's basically it. Oh, that's all the quirks it has. Other than that, you can say widths for it, say 100 pixels. It respects those. You can say heights for it. It respects those as well. All the margins and paddings are also respected as you would expect. There, 50 pixels margins everywhere, and padding there. That's more 56 pixels. Yeah, it's still 50 pixels. Yep, there we go. That's about it. Both of these work in this way only in the flow layout. So before moving on to the layouts, does anybody have any questions so far? I think you can raise hands if you do. Nothing. Cool. That means I'm a great presenter. Display inside. This value dictates the layout of the direct child elements. Direct child elements just means you can have multiple layouts nested in each other without upsetting one another because they just affect the next layer in the box tree. The first one is called flow. This is the default one that everybody knows. It's the one that I was talking about so far. All the inline elements are going to be set on the same line. That's if they fit, otherwise they wrap to the next one. We have on the left side here, I'm not sure if it's going to be that clear to read, but we have a paragraph, which by default is a block layout, sorry, a block type element, another paragraph in the span. And you see blocks are positioned vertically, and the span, which is another inline, just goes on the next line because the block doesn't allow anything on its side. You kept hearing me about having them horizontally and vertically. That's not always the case. The specs actually define them as, sorry, relative to the direction the language you're using goes to. So in English, it goes from left to right for words and for paragraphs from top to bottom. In, I think, Chinese, I might be mistaken, it goes from right to left, top to bottom. Sorry, from top to bottom, the writing, and from left to right, right to left, the paragraphs. So this is going to be entirely flipped around if you had it in Chinese. But just to simplify things, I'm just going to mention it in English. So just extrapolate for Chinese if you have Chinese to use, right? Also, the experimental tag here, I'm going to talk about it when we get to the last part. So ignore it for now. Now, the flow layout has sort of a sibling. It's called flow root. This is like its twin, but it has a bit of a quirk to it. It does everything the exact same way the flow layout does, but it also creates a new block formatting context. Now, if you're not familiar with this, this is just a fancy way of saying that whatever is in a div or an element is not going to interact with whatever is outside of it. This usually applies to floats and margins. And when I say margins, I mean collapsing margins. I'm going to go more into details with that immediately, but just to mention it first, there already were ways to make a new block formatting context. Like, for example, just making a new HTML element that's going to make a new context because you're just making a new page. Floats also get a new block formatting context, inline blocks as well, and there's a whole list of them. And you can see display flow root here as well. The issue with those is that all of them have side effects, and that meant that either you had to bear with them or find a way to counter them. Well, now we have display flow root for that. As for the floats and things like that, I don't think we have an example here. Oh, we do. Cool. This thing here is an element with the flow layout. This is a floated box. You might have run into the issue if you used floats where the parent element does not contain its floats. That's fixed with this new block formatting context. There's also the exclude floats, like in this case here. This floats can overlap this element here, but in this place it's displayed as a flow root, and so the float doesn't allow it to be behind it. And the last one, which I can show here because I have a quick example for it, is collapsing margins. Now, collapsing margins is an interesting feature, and that put quotation marks on that. It is a feature, but it doesn't always work the way you want it to work. If you look here at this paragraph, let's give it a width, sorry, a height, so it's clearer to see. Okay, if you look at this paragraph here, there, you see it has a margin. That's the orange box at the bottom of the blue square there, blue rectangle, sorry. That's because I defined it to have 40 pixels as a margin. That's for the top part. And by default, it comes with margin bottom, which is this one, 1 EM, which is just that space. Ignore the measurement itself. The next paragraph has the exact same thing. It has a margin start 1 EM. But if you look at the two of them, it looks a bit weird. That's because the margins are collapsed. And what that means is if two margins touch each other, they're going to transform into a single margin, which is going to be the height of the biggest margin. This only happens vertically, not horizontally. But there's also another scenario where that happens, and that is if a block element has margins at the top, like this paragraph here, and it touches its parent's margin, then it again collapses. So in this case, even though I said I want this, I don't even know how to call this color, this dark purple at the end, at the back of the elements, I told it to be 40 pixels away from whatever is above it. I also told the paragraph inside it to be 40 pixels away from whatever is above it. You don't see an extra margin here because they collapsed. While here, what I set the main div, which is this dark purple, if it be a flow root, it doesn't collapse the margin. And you can just see that there's one margin there and one margin for the parent there. Those are basically the places where it's useful to have a new block formatting context if you don't like collapsing margins. I'm calling them a feature because usually they're supposed to work for you by having multiple elements with defining margins on them and not having to deal with double margins here and there. But that's beside the point of what we're trying to do here. Let's move on to the next layout, the table layout. Now, it is said that in ancient times, the layouts were done using table elements. Those table elements were obviously put in HTML. You would just deal with having the header on one row, having the nav on one column, couple of rows. It's kind of easy to define a layout on a table. Well, now we have display properties for those. So that means you can make anything look like a table. Like you can see here, we don't have any table element in here. All of them are using display values. The layout display value is called table, but we have one for every single element you can have in a table. These enter the category of display internals. That's why they are not on the side menu there. So we're not going to have a special part of them. The main place where you might want to use this is if you want to have an element not look like a table on a certain width of screen. I think that's about it. I'm not sure what other ways. Oh, of course, there are other hacks you can use because display table cell has specific quirks about it. I'm not going to go into them because they're hacks, so that's not really the intended way of them working, but it is what it is. Do you have any questions so far? I'm going to take that silence as a no or as a nobody can unmute themselves.
If you have any questions, you can just also use the reactions to raise your hand. So yeah, thank you, Paul. Everything's done.
Okay, cool. Let's see. Nope, no flex. We don't touch that yet. That's fancy. During my research, I found something interesting. There is another layout that's a composite layout, like the table layout, which needs more elements inside it. It's called Ruby. Anybody heard about Ruby? Not the language, it's a layout. That's a no again, probably. I didn't either. This is the Ruby use case. It allows you to add annotations at the bottom or at the top of a piece of text. Mostly it's used when it's about Japanese and Chinese characters, where you have either different characters for the same thing, because they have different sets of characters for different occasions. They have traditional, simplified, a lot of things like that. Or I also saw them used as the phonemes for that character. So you had she, la, all those. I don't know Chinese or Japanese, but you get what I mean. Well, regardless, this is another composite layout, let's say. So the CSS guys provided us with a way of doing the same thing we can do with the table with the Ruby element. You might notice it doesn't work here. That's because these properties are not yet supported by Chrome. If you look at the list here, you see Chrome doesn't like Ruby yet, but eventually it might. Right. Well, we went through the basics and the old news. Let's move on to the shiny new guns that CSS provides us. The first one is Flex. Flex is a unidirectional layout. It provides a lot of tools for distributing space and aligning stuff. There is this fancy guide here. I'm going to show it to you at the end. It's what got me into loving Flex. But I also made a quick reference page for it. So, first of all, if you just make an element display as a flex, there's a couple of things it does. You might notice here that all these block elements, which are divs in code, by the way, they don't behave as blocks. That's why I said that that behavior only happens in the block flow. In the flow layout, right? You can also see they are aligned from left to right, and that's about it. Now, you can decide on the direction you want the elements to be in. You can have them go from left to right, right to left, top to bottom, bottom to top. The HTML here is the same for every single example. The only difference is the display here. It's flex direction column for display flex. I added examples on the side with code so I can just reference them. And usually they're just written in the style part. So look forward to that. Next, you can also say if you want to wrap elements. So if they don't fit, like this inline element 6 here, you can tell them to wrap on the next row, or wrap reverse, which just means that the elements that don't fit at the end, they are moved on a row above. So you can just see that here. Don't know what scenarios you might want to wrap reverse, but it's there. It's nice to have. Next, it's something we're going to see a lot in these two layouts. There's a lot of shorthand properties, the same way you have for margins. Instead of having to always define margin top, bottom, left, right, you can just say margin and say all the values you want for them. We also have shorthand properties for flex properties. Flex flow is for defining the direction and the wrap. Here's an example where this is a flex flow column wrap reverse. Because it's column, and I wanted it to be column because it's not that easy to show by resizing things. I can just show it to you here what it does. It just adds new columns when it doesn't fit. Yeah, there it is in action. Cool. That's the main thing about the flow and direction. Next, we go to aligning things. You can just align things on the main axis however you want. There's so many properties. Let's go through them. You have flex start aligns to the top, to the start. Flex end, you know what that means. Center is center. Space between is going to take all this extra space you have here and split it equally between all the elements. Space around is going to take all this extra space here, split it into the number of elements, and then give each of them half as a margin on the left, half as a margin on the right. So this space here is half this size. Space evenly is just gonna have even spaces everywhere. Then we can align things vertically. You can say you want them at the top, at the bottom, in the middle. You can have them stretched from top to bottom. You can also use baseline, which this might not look like it, but it's supposed to align the elements baseline itself. Not sure why this doesn't really work with my inline element one here, because the one is way lower than the rest. But that's what it aligns. It doesn't care about paddings and margins and widths and heights. It just does that. Then we have align content, which instead of aligning the elements themselves, like align items, it aligns the flex rows. So when it wraps, they have multiple rows. You can have them at the top, at the bottom, in the center, stretched out so they fill all the space equally. Space between, space around, and I think it's pretty rare if we have 3 rows. You can get a clearer picture of what they do. And that's all the properties you can have on the parent element. We can move on to the child element, but if you have questions, I'm checking reactions, no reactions. If you have questions while I'm going through this, please add a reaction so I can just get to you. Right, moving on to child elements. One thing that wasn't there before, or rather that you could do with floats, but it was a hack again. You can reorder elements however you want. That means you're not dependent on the HTML to have the elements in a specific order. In this case right here, this is the unordered, this is the ordered, and I'm going to go through what happens exactly here. By default, each element has the order 0. For block 5 right here, I gave it the order -1. There's nothing that's less than that, so it's the first. And I also gave orders for inline 2 here and block 2 here. Now that means we're left with block 1, inline element 1, and inline 6 here. These all have order 0, so they're gonna be displayed in the same order they appear in the HTML file. So that's basically the default order they take if they have the same order. And then inline 2 has the order 1, that's the next one, and block 2 has order 4. This is just to show you don't have to have the orders consecutive. You can just have one be 1 million, so you can make sure it's always the last one. That's it for orders. Then we get to resizing things, which is another nice feature of Flex. It kind of flexes elements to fill in all the elements, all the extra spaces it has. Let me resize this a bit so it's clear to see there. All of these blocks here have this base width. They just have the width of the content, so there should be all equal. In these examples, I set the flex grow properties for the first block and second block here to be the same value, which is 1. I'm going to get into what that means immediately. And here, block 1 has flex grow 1, block 2 has flex grow 2. If you look at them grow, block 3 did not have flex grow at all, so it says the same size. Here they are equal, here they are not, but block 2 is not twice the size of block 1. And here's why. The space between when this was collapsed and nothing grew is split into how many flex grow values you have in the flex container. Then every single element gets the amount of parts equal to its flex grow property. So that means that here, even though the block 1, when the block 1 base size is this, it got the same amount of width as block 2. While in this part, the space between my mouse and the end of block 1 is half the size of the space between my mouse and the end of block 2, where my mouse is at the base width of each block. Kind of weird to wrap it around, but that's basically what it means. Next one is flex shrink. Right. If you look at this, when it's not growing, but it has a shrink, you can see all the elements shrink equally. That's because that's controlled by a different property, flex shrink. Now, if I make this wider, you see this one doesn't grow because obviously it doesn't have flex grow. But when it shrinks again at different rates. Now it's a bit weirder than flex grow in the sense that by my logic, I feel like block 1 and block 2 should shrink before block 3. But block 3 also shrinks a bit. But in the end, all those sizes there mean the same thing as they do in flex grow. The depth of space the flex container has is split equally to as many parts as the flex shrink properties there are. So here, for example, I had it flex shrink 3 here. So it's going to be split in 6, and then it's going to be subtracted from each element according to its flex shrink property. Here, for example, the space that was shrunk from block element 2 is twice the space that was shrunk from block element 1. There's a lot of blocks that I'm going to talk about here. So if there's any questions you have, please feel free to interfere.
There is a question in chat from Christian.
Yeah.
Can you tell the flex grow which direction to fill, right, left?
No, the flex grow is going to grow kind of both ways. It's just going to expand to fill in the space. If you wanted to grow to the left or to the right, you're actually looking into changing the alignment of the contents that are inside. So in our case, since this is a text flow inside, you can just use text align to say align to the center. So now when it's going to grow in both sides. But the main thing is the width of the container changes. Whatever is inside is aligned to your own whims. I hope that answers your questions.
Yep, thanks.
Perfect, cool. Moving on, flex basis. Flex basis tells the flex container what the base width is. It's kind of like width, meaning it's exactly width, but it's an extra property. If you want to use the elements width, you just give flex basis the value of auto. But then there's also a couple of extra values like content, min content, and max content. Properties which are supported only by Firefox right now. So you can't really use them if you want to have a website that looks the same on all browsers. But you can use all matters of units. You can tell it how wide to be in pixels, in view units, in EMs, REMs, all those stuff works here. But as I said, it's basically the width property. It does pretty much the same thing. It's still gonna shrink, but the place where it starts shrinking has the width that you tell it in code. For this example, this is 100 pixels, this is 200 pixels, and this is auto, which means it's just gonna take the text width. So this is half this size right now. Not much to tell about that. Then we move on to another shorthand property. If you don't want to have all three of these, it's actually recommended to use the flex property, where you just give it in order the flex grow, the flex shrink, and the flex basis of all the elements. In this case here, the first one grows 1 part, shrinks 3 parts, and has 300 pixels width, which means this isn't really its normal size. It's shrunk a bit. There, that's the normal size. This one's 100 pixels, grows 10 times, but doesn't shrink at all. And this one doesn't shrink at all and just keeps its size. So this means in our example, this is not going to shrink. The other one's going to make room for everything else. But also when the screen is wide enough, the block element 2 is just going to rocket out. Now, at the start here, this again isn't 10 times the size of this one. That's because this one started with a width of 300, while this one started somewhere around here. So all the flex growth this block element does is appended to those 300 pixels. That means it has a bit of a an advantage to growing. That's what flex gives you if you want to grow, shrink. Well, basically, if you want to flex your elements in HTML. The next thing it allows you to do, and this is the last property we have for flex, if you don't like the alignment to be applied to all the elements, you can have some elements be in their teenage year and say, no, that I don't want to align to what you want. and just set their alignment individually. Not enough said. It just gets the same values you can set on the parent. You can just set them here. So you got flex start, flex end, basis, all that kind of stuff. If there are no more questions or no questions at all, I have a very quick small layout made only with flex for a website. Just imagine there is lorem ipsum everywhere. I was a bit lazy to add it, but it's something. A simple layout. We have some main content here. It's aligned to the center. Let me get rid of this now. Then we have a header, some main content here, and a footer. I'm going to walk with you through the code so we see how this is actually done. The first thing we have is this main container here. Let me zoom out a little bit so we see everything. Right, so we have this main container here. I made it a flex container just because I can use this thing here, justify content, to make its only child, which is the main container. Come on, there. This one aligned to the center of the page. Quick, easy way to make something go in the center. Its child, by the way, doesn't grow, doesn't shrink. It just takes the, 80% of its parent width. So it's going to move a bit, so it's responsive as well. No reason why I did that, just so it's easier to explain things. Okay, its child as well is a flex container. It's got display flex here, but this one is displayed as a column instead. Now this is kind of not necessary. You can just have the flow layout and have a bunch of blocks, because that's exactly how they lay out. But I just wanted to flex a bit more flex in this layout here. Then we have a header, which is just a pink box, a footer, which is a green box, and in the middle we have the content area, which is another flex container, where I have a couple of panels here. They just have a base width, height, and they're flexing a bit. While the parent just said, hey, I want this to be a row and I want it to wrap around. That's how you get this nice feature where things just move around. Now, this also has justify content center because I want to show you this other kind of layout you can have. Imagine an Instagram page. You can also simply add new panels to this layout and they just place themselves as if by magic without you having to do a lot of extra work. This is kind of why I love Flex. And that's about it. As you saw, we needed multiple Flex layouts. We need one horizontally to center things here, one vertically here to have all the elements vertically because that's how we want them, and one here to display all the contents in a row, wrapping them around. That means the HTML part looks a bit, well, it looks like an HTML document. It's like a tree. It's not bad. It's not good. It can be better, is what I mean. Do you have any questions so far or anything you'd like me to do to break this layout? You're being too kind to it. But then we can move on to the next piece of weaponry we got from the CSS guys. Grid. Now, remember how I told you that in ancient times people used tables and we don't use them anymore now? Grid kind of lets you make tables, but there's a quirk to it, and that is Grid doesn't care about your HTML code. So you don't have to have the HTML structure necessary to make the table to have a table now. That's kind of the power of Grid. So Grid is more advanced than Flex because, well, if you look at the guides for it or the specs, it's about twice the size. But that's mostly because it gives you a lot of customization options. Let's get started. First of all, if you just set an element to display grid, it's going to take all of its children and display them on separate rows, one after the other. Now, again, blocks and inline elements are handled exactly the same. It doesn't care. Well, this is kind of a boring grid. You don't necessarily want to have this. You just have blocks one after the other. You just have a block flow layout. But you can set template rows and template columns. This is the moment where we're going to have to go through more CSS than HTML. Mostly because grid is mostly CSS. So when you set a template for rows and a template for columns, you can also give names to lines. And specifically here, it's the lines of the grid you're making. So this will be the line above the first row. This will be the line under the first row. And the reason you might want to do this is because you can use them when you want to specify where an element is going to be placed. Also, there is this weird unit of measure here. That's one fraction. It behaves kind of the same way the one in FlexGrow behaves. It just says one part of the whole grid. So that means our grid here on the side is going to make the first column, because we have that as a column as well. Grid template columns there. It's going to make the first column just go as wide as it can to fill in all the space. Now, just to explain the example itself, we set the position for the inline 2 element and for the inline 6 element. You can see them right here. Inline 2 element says I want to start from the line row 1 start, which is the first line, and I want to end on the line row 1 end. That would be this line in the grid. So it just stole the first spot for block 1. Then we have for the other one, we want to start at the first line, and we also want to span. This is a keyword you can use when you define where you want this to end. You want it to span 2 rows. So then inline 6 is going to span 2 rows. But then we're left with all the other elements here. And what they're going to do is they're just going to fill in the other cells that are remaining. So block 1 just goes here. There's no more spaces in this row, so block 2 will go on the next row. Inline element fits on the same row on the next column, and then block 5. There is a nice little feature that Chrome brings with it. If you have display elements, sorry, display grids, you can see the actual lines in the grid here. You can't see the names, which maybe I'm nitpicking, but that would be a nice feature. But you basically can see the structure of your grid. Do you have any questions so far?
Yeah. Hey, Paul.
Hey.
Can you please specify some scenarios that are better suited for grid and for Flexbox?
Yep.
I mean, why would you use one and not the other?
I'm going to get into that when I finish with the grid, so I can compare the two of them. So I'm on it, don't worry. Okay. Right, so shorthand properties. I told you we'll see a bunch of those. Oh, wait, no. Grid template areas. I forgot about this one. This is actually my favorite part of grid. You can define areas in your grid to be occupied by blocks. So in this example here, I hope you can see the code. Let me zoom in a bit if you can't. I defined the grid with 3 rows, 3 columns. And then here I said, okay, I want this cell, this cell, this cell, and this cell to be block 1. These 3 to be block 2, this one to be block 3, and this just means I want it to be empty. And then in order to link these areas with the elements in HTML, you define the grid area property for it and just give it the same name you give it here. And so we got this table here where block 1, let me actually show you this. Block 1 fills in the square of 4 cells on the corner top left. Block 2 fills the entire right column, and block 3 fills the one on the left bottom. I think this is pretty awesome because this actually looks exactly like a layout. You can even space things out a bit so it's also formatted nicely. And this means you can make your CSS a lot more clear, a lot more explanatory, descriptive, that's the word, as to what layouts you want to have. Maybe you might be wondering, maybe not. I know I've been wondering this a lot when I started with it until I just put my hand on it and tried to. What happens if we say we want to have an area look like not a rectangle, so not a box? Well, when you try to do that, it breaks. It just breaks. Doesn't like that one bit. But as long as your areas are rectangle shaped, it works perfectly. Cool. Now, I was going for shorthands because that's what follows next. There's grid template, which is a shorthand for everything. Now, this is going to be a bit hard to read right here, but I have the code on the side here, so this is easier to read. When you want to define a grid template, you can add the grid row specification, the grid columns templates, and the areas themselves. And the syntax is sort of intuitive, but you just have to know it first. You can give names to rows on the start and end of the line. Then you give the template row. Then you give the size of the row itself. Rinse and repeat until you finish with all the rows. Add a slash and then add the column sizes. You can also give names to the columns right here in between these, the same way you would do with the column templates. I think I saw my Zoom blink here. Is there a question?
Yeah, there are a few. Aside from the one from Claudio, Christian asked, what about that empty space in grid?
This one, the dot right here. Are you asking if it can be not a square?
No, I was referring to the first example because yeah, I mean I
This
kind
one.
of get it. Yeah, I was expecting for block 5 to go all the way.
Well, what it does is it just puts every element in a single cell. It doesn't put it in multiple cells, even though there's space for it. Is that clear?
Yeah, okay. I saw it after you went to the developer tools and saw the Chrome
The grid.
doing its job.
That's a cool grid, man.
Yeah.
So
Cool.
Paul, if you want it to be extended, you need to span it, right?
Yep. You would need to go here and say, well, you also need to tell it. Actually, I think you have column span as well. Column span 2. No, sorry. This is a unsupported property. Anyway, you would need to tell it on what line of the column to start and on what line of the column to end, or how many columns to span. That's correct. So I would need to be explicit here and say grid column, start on the first line, span 2, slash here, space here, set 3, and also probably not set it on all the elements, but just the ones that I want. Cut. There. Now it fits 3 rows, 3 columns. I wanted to. There we go. So you would have to do this for it to behave the way you wanted.
Okay, thanks.
No problem. Any other questions?
There is one more question, but you can also wait up until you finish presenting grid. It's can you combine grid with flex?
Okay.
And
The answer
we
is
can
yes.
go. Okay.
And I'll give more details about that soon. Right. So next one, grid template shorthand. You can also define the gaps between the rows and columns. That's pretty straightforward. You just say row gap 10 pixels. It has 10 pixels row gap here, same as the column gap. I don't think there's anything unclear about that. You also have a shorthand for it. You can say, I want to have a gap of 10 pixels for the row, 30 pixels for the column. And there's a lot more of them. Some of them are not that easy to explain using just an example. So I'm going to cheat a bit and I'm going to go to the website that taught me a lot of what I know about grid. This here, by the way, also exists for Flex. It describes everything so clearly that you understand everything when you read it. And I usually go on it when I need to find that specific value that I wanted and I don't remember it. But cheating a bit right here. Grid gaps. There we go. I'm going to cheat with this because it's plain and simple since we went through Flex already. You can define how contents of a cell will align in the cell horizontally And vertically, you can define, sorry, there's a shorthand property for this as well. You can define how the grid itself is going to align in its parent if there is extra space, both horizontally and, by the way, horizontally, there's this cute little thing where you can just have extra spaces between the columns themselves with space around and space between, which looks oddly similar to what Flex allows you to do. Right, so both horizontally and vertically, and again, same thing vertically with extra spacing between the lines. And shorthand property, and then this one's an interesting one. You saw when I specified there for the block 5 to be 3 columns wide, it automatically added a new column. That's because this is what grid usually does when there's columns that don't exist, or the same for rows. And using these properties, you can define the sizes of those columns and rows. So in this quick example here, you have this grid right here and 2 elements, one that's inside the grid, one that would be outside the grid. By default, the spacing between these would be 0 because that's the default value, but you might want to, what's the word? To keep the appearance of a grid there. So you might want all the columns to be the same width. But in that case, you can just say, I want all the automatically added columns to be 60 pixels. And again, the same for the rows. And the last interesting property is grid autoflow, which defines how the grid is going to try to fill in its cells. You can use this to make our example from the top. Instead of doing its default behavior, which is to add new rows whenever we have new element, we can say we want them to be columns, new columns every time we add them. So this might look a bit like Flex to you, maybe, maybe not. It kind of does to me, but I think that's the last fancy. Oh, right, before I forget, the god of all shorthand properties is this one. It lets you define the template rows, template columns, template areas, auto rows, auto columns, auto flow. That's 6 different properties you can set for it. Not sure if I would ever use it, although in the examples it shows here, it's pretty simple. So it's very useful probably when you have very, very small grids. But when you want to use grid template areas, well, it looks like this. And that might not be that easy to understand. That, well, I think there's nothing here about the auto rows, auto columns. But yeah, that's the last of the parent properties we have for the grid. Any questions so far about the parent properties and not about using flex and grids and advantages and disadvantages? I'll take that as a no. Next one, child properties. Now we kind of already went through this. You need them if you want to use the grid in a specific way. You can define where a block will start, and both on the rows and the columns. As I said before, you can say you want them to span a certain number of elements, right? This is what I was looking for. Right, you can tell them to span a certain number of elements. You can also tell them to span until they meet a specific line by name. So you can tell this one to span until it meets the last column, call to end, and it's going to give you the same thing. I think this one was for rows actually. Row 3 end, there you go. Another thing is, of course, shorthands for this too. Just say grid row, grid column, and put a slash between the values. So here, this is the start, this is the end. And the grid area, which again, I showed it to you before, you just specify the name you put in the template area, and it's just going to show up there. Now, that's all the properties, kind of. Again, I cheated with the child elements. There's another alignment one that's pretty easy. Align self, you just tell them to sit on top, bottom. There's also a justify self, left, right. So you can be even more rebellious than in Flex. And a shorthand property for it, place self. Right, That's all the properties we have in grid. That's a lot. Actually, if you look at the scroll bar here, this is the size of the scroll bar for grid. This is the size of the scroll bar for flex. It's well, they're both small, but flex is half the size. I have an example layout here as well. It doesn't look as pretty as flex one, but there is a slight difference here, and that is if you look at the HTML, it's everything at the same level, and I really wanted to emphasize this. Maybe you won't have the content looking like this in your website, but if you have multiple elements, they can all be at the same level. You don't have to have multiple layouts because you want to have something horizontally and something vertically. So this layout is just a big grid where the template is first row header, last row footer, and then one panel on each cell, one after the other. And you get exactly what you asked for. By the way, for panels, I set grid area right here. And for all the other ones, it's here. So it's not missing anywhere. This doesn't look as pretty as the flow one. And that's mostly because the flow one doesn't necessarily adhere to a grid. Let me actually just show that hacks because I didn't put the website anywhere yet. Right. You can have things like this on a flex grid, sorry, on a flex layout, but you can't have it on this grid unless you start working with spans and spanning them by yourself, and that doesn't feel like a very productive thing. But this is a very rigid way of setting your overall layout of the website. So coming back to Claudia's question, ideally you would use both. You would use the grid layout when you want to make the overall layout of your website. So you want a header at the top, a navbar on the side, or a banner or an ad if you want money for your website on the other side, and a block that's your content block. And then inside that block, you could use display flex to get this pretty little wrapping you have here, where everything just fills in the space and it looks nice and neat and ordered. Yeah, that's kind of my conclusion to this. Do you have questions so far?
Edward is asking, would you use display grid in an actual production application environment? That
depends. I didn't go through this yet, but actually I'm gonna make you have a guess. Which one do you think appeared first, display flex or display grid? This is a question for everybody. Just thumbs up if you think it's flex first, and thumbs. Okay, we've got the grid there. Just write it in chat then. So grid was first. Okay, yes, grid was first, but there's a caveat there. Grid was made by Microsoft first, the specs for it. And it wasn't a very pretty piece of spec. It didn't have support for many features we have here, like the gaps or aligning items inside the cell properly. And it was only implemented in Internet Explorer. But at some point, some big CSS hero came up and decided this would be a good idea if I would rework it a bit. And by rework it a bit, I mean rewrite it from scratch, which he did. And now we got this documentation. But Internet Explorer still only supports the old one. So that means that if in your production environment, you are also expected to support Internet Explorer, you probably don't want to do that, because otherwise you need to use their layout. You can use the auto prefixer for this, and what it does is for gaps, for example, it just adds new rows and columns in between, so you can resize those as well. But that also changes the number of lines an element should span to, so you have to do a lot of maintenance on that side. Bottom line, I wouldn't recommend it unless it's necessary, definitely. So if the layout you're trying to do really needs it, then I wouldn't recommend it. And when I say really needs it, there is a thing you can do with grid that you count with flex, and that is you can change entirely the layout you have. So if you want, you can just decide, I want this header to be on the side now, and I want to have these elements here, and the footer is just going to be a single block here. You can't really do that with flex, at least not easily. And you might end up doing the same hack that's done with the burger menu. Most of the implementations that I saw, at least before Flex came up, what happened was that there were actually two sections of HTML, one for the nav menu to show up top, and one where it's collapsed in a burger menu, and you just hid or shown one according to the media query. That adds more maintenance to your website. If you need to change a menu item, you need to make sure you change it in both places. So there's a lot of error space there. With grid, you can just decide, okay, these items here are not just going to be parts of this column here. So it's easier to do. If there are no more questions about this, we can just do a quick sprint in the other elements we've got. We are halfway down. Sorry, we're actually at the second element in the menu here, but that's because all of these are quite simple to understand. So let's sprint through them. First of all, list item defines whether an element should or should not generate a marker box. The marker box is this thing on the left. And the way I make this show up is I make the parent have a padding, because without that padding, well, the marker box is somewhere away, like right there. And the browser generates a marker box here. You can use the same CSS you would use with a list to define what symbol to use there. So there, now it's a circle, even though that might not be that clear. Square there, cool. That's about it. If there's any questions, just write them in the chat and I'll do a flash answer to it. Next one, display box. Display box mentions tells the browser whether to generate boxes or not. There's the value none, which you probably know when you try to hide things. Very, very briefly, I need to say that this doesn't mean it hides it from being viewed. It doesn't make a box for it at all in the box tree. So in our case here, we have the element, but if you look at it, there's nothing there. What you saw was the parent elements. So there's absolutely no box there. It's as if it's not there at all. Anyway, none says neither you nor your children nor your children's children will have a box in my tree. And content says you can't have a box in my tree, but your children can. This is useful when you try to group up things in ways where you don't want them to be seen as grouped up normally. This is just going to make it look like the children of a display contents element look as if they were actually the parent of this one. That's hard to say. But it's going to behave exactly as if this is inline. So we have a div here. It has display contents. If we hover over the div itself, come on, there. No box is there, but the children have a box. And it looks that big because it's wrapped around. There, that's the box. Okay, and the last one, which is where I come to the experimental tag there. In the CSS specs, the display property is defined as allowing multiple keywords to obtain a certain effect. So all of the elements here, inline, block, and flow root, table, etc., are supposed to be combined together. So if you want a inline grid, you say display inline space grid. Well, there are a couple of scenarios where you can't get the same effect using a single keyword. That's what I'm looking for. And that's why there are some legacy display properties. These, I think, are supposed to just go away when every browser supports multiple keywords for the display property. Currently, I think only Firefox does. Now, you might wonder why inline just works as it is. Well, we have a table here with all the shorthand values and long-handed values. To make this smaller. Right. So for an inline, it says it's inline flow. Now, the default value, if it's not specified for the layout, is going to always be flow. So a block, even though the short keyword is block, it's gonna be block flow in the end. The default value for something that's not, sorry, for an outside, what's the word for the outside keyword, is going to be block. That's why when I say flex, it's going to make it a block flex. Same with grid. And the default value, if you don't have either of those, is going to always be block and flow. So here for list item, this is also the keyword we use, but it defaults to the block outside layout and the flow inside layout. This is just a list of all of them. I'm not sure how soon we're gonna see these show up when you write code in Chrome, or for Chrome rather. But these feel a bit to me like they're more specific, because you know when you see the display property, it's gonna be a block with a flow layout inside. But that's about it for my presentations. If there are any questions. Yes, Flex works on EA with some keyword differences. Display Flex used to be display Flexbox at some point. So you need to kind of support those as well. Sorry, the question was if I tried this on EA. I forgot to repeat that. For grid though, I had the misfortune of doing it, and that's how I burned my fingers with it. We had an interesting layout to do. I think it's better if I open Paint, my favorite layout drawer, and explain what we had to have. We were supposed to have, this is the big page. We were supposed to have a header here. Some buttons on the side here, and then an error container here if there were any errors, then a bunch of blocks here for a specific thing, and a bunch of blocks. Damn it, I made the box different color when I shouldn't have. Right, and a bunch of blocks here for another thing. That was the desktop layout. The mobile layout was supposed to be thinner square. It was supposed to be this thing first, then, come on, Paint, work with me. Then yellow, then the side menu thing with the burger menu, of course. Then warnings, then green blocks, then blue box. Now, sure, that works. Now, if you try to do this with just Flex, or if you try to make use the flow layout for it, it's gonna suck a bit because you have different types of layouts here. You had one horizontal layout here to have the aside and the main content here. One vertical here to have the header, the warning thing, and this content box. Another horizontal here, which you needed to have the two columns, and then each of them flow layouts. Now, let me draw it out with gray. So that's one layout this way, another layout the same way here, and one layout this way here. Right, I made the layout weird again. There, fixed. Cool. Right. Well, since you had these boxes, you had a certain HTML tree. If you wanted to have this one here, where they all interconnect this way, you needed to have this element at the same level as this element, or at least have this at a higher element. Then this one at the same level as this one again. And these ones needed to be at the same, let me think. Oh, I remember, I got the layout a bit wrong. This warning box was supposed to be only for the blue square. So it would be somewhere on top of this, and this would be up. Right. So you'd have this one that need to be at the same level as this one. It's a lot of HTML changes. And one option was to duplicate the entire code in HTML and have it follow different HTML tree structure. And the other one was to use grid instead. I went for grid because it looked really pretty. And then I stumbled onto Internet Explorer. Then I used Autoflow, which broke things about the layout. But we got a promise from the customer that we're not going to be supporting Internet Explorer for that long. So we went with grid. I did use that. I think you're talking about the media query to make sure you use CSS for Internet Explorer specifically, right?
Yeah, it's the thing that you always need to have, right?
Yeah.
When dealing with that.
The issue was more that the problems were at the HTML level, not the CSS level. The entire HTML structure needed to be changed for this to be possible. So using grid, I could have all of them at the same level and just say, okay, this area is for the header, this area is for the menu, and oh, you're on mobile, let's change everything around. That meant at the end, our CSS looked something like, here is the pretty, let me draw a square. Here is the pretty grid code. And then somewhere at the bottom, here's the big red Internet Explorer alternative to make it work there as well. The idea was that when we don't need support Internet Explorer anymore, we just get rid of the red square. Thank you for joining me.